We are now going to be looking into the top 25 poll that was released for college football just yesterday, the first preseason rankings for the upcoming college football season. And at the very top, not too many surprises. It's a little bit of the usual suspects, specifically looking at Georgia and Ohio State as the top two. To round out the top five, it is Oregon back in the mix once again, Texas and Alabama. So how we're going to go about this is we're going to be sort of jumping around here, but with Georgia being the number one overall team and one of the 9 teams in the SEC that are in the top 25 this year, the most ever from one conference in the preseason top 25, I want to start with the power dynamic in the Southeast Conference, where Georgia being number one really is no surprise. This is a team that was, on the brink of making the playoffs last year, obviously losing the SEC championship game to Alabama, especially with how contested it was around that playoff race last year. They ended up getting knocked out, but you can very easily make an argument that they were a top 4 team in college football last year, and they're returning a lot of very impactful players, including Carson Beck at quarterback, who should definitely be one of the top quarterbacks in the NFL. I'm not sure, obviously talking college football versus NFL, but Carson Beck, I think if he turns out a good season here, he's kind of done everything that's been asked of him and has flown under the radar throughout the course of it. Georgia obviously had a much easier schedule last year, so there wasn't quite as much asked of him, but with a stronger SEC, I think Georgia's going to be more battle-tested during the regular season. I think that because they're going to have these tests, as long as they can come out with 2 or less losses, they should, in a 12 playoff team format, definitely be in the dance by the end of the year. But outside of Georgia, including Georgia, I should say, 4 out of the top 6 teams in the preseason polls are out of the SEC. Like I mentioned, Texas at number 4, Alabama at number 5, and Ole Miss at number 6. And I think that ultimately, there are a number of these teams where, you can make different arguments. I do think that Texas is going to be a very good team. I know some people are worried about whether or not the transition to the SEC is going to be too much for them, but I think that this is still a very talented Texas team. Quinn Ewers has not fully lived up to expectations, but at this point he's going to be one of the more experienced quarterbacks in college football, and I think that he has the arm talent to get the job done there. Sarkisian is an incredible coach, so I'm not saying, I think it's going to be maybe a little bit of a bumpy start for them in SEC play, but they are absolutely going to be in the mix of things. Alabama, I personally am not too concerned with them either. I think that Kalen DeBoer is a very good head coach, and obviously losing Saban is a massive loss, but I think DeBoer is also probably as good of a replacement as you could have gotten for Saban on such short notice. So I like that. The questions with Alabama, though, do come a lot with Jalen Milroe. Is he going to be able to fully develop? We know the athletic skills from him and the fact that we have seen him be able to use his legs. He has a strong arm. Do they have the deep downfield receiving threats that Alabama has had for the past decade or so? It feels a little bit more limited there. And then Ole Miss is another team that I think could definitely, end up being a team on the outside looking in when it comes to the playoffs, coming in at 6. I understand Jackson Dart is an incredible player, and they do have a little bit of a nice offense headed into next year. Trey Harris rounds out a pretty nice quarterback wide receiver duo, but losing Quinshon Judkins I do think is a huge loss for them, and it's going to come down to a little bit for Ole Miss whether or not they can hang in with the physicality in this upcoming season, and I think they're definitely going to be in the mix, but I was a little bit surprised to see them at number 6. two of the more controversial rankings, at least because I think that they're kind of a little bit controversial programs, just for the sake of whether or not they've lived up to expectations in recent years, is Notre Dame and Penn State coming in at number 7 and 8. Notre Dame is a team that I never really have all that much faith in, and I understand it's probably some sort of bias as well because of the fact that they're not in a conference. They always do seem to let down that I see that logo, and I just maybe unfairly associate it with coming up short. But Notre Dame also, it's going to be an interesting year for them because Riley Leonard should be a pretty good quarterback to run the system for them. I really liked him at Duke, especially in 2022, but last year hindered with injuries to the point where we never fully got to see him flourish after, I believe it was last year that he led the upset over Clemson, which is great, but again, not totally sure what you're going to get from a health perspective there. A lot of losses on the offensive line, both of their starting tackles to the NFL draft, and then their projected starting left tackle, Charles Jagusa, I think is how you pronounce it, Jagusa. He was supposed to be their starting left tackle, and he is out for the season with a torn pec injury. So definitely a lot of knocks on their offense, losing their running back Audric Estime as well to the NFL. It's going to be a very different looking offense, and one that I think is going to have a lot of pressure surrounding it. Now, Notre Dame, the way that their schedule plays out, actually scheduled a pretty easy one, especially in comparison to what we sort of view Notre Dame schedules as they are typically like. I mean, not as of right now, obviously preseason top 25 again, not all that substantial, but just 3 ranked teams in at Texas A&M to start off the season. I mean, that should be a very fun game there. But outside of that, it's Florida State in early November and then at USC at the end of November. Outside of that, though, really not even too many middling teams that you feel all that great about. So Notre Dame, I'm definitely curious in terms of whether and what their chances look like if they were to be a 2-loss team this year. I think that they're a little high, but again, I feel like inherently I am a little biased against Notre Dame. So if you think I'm wrong on that, definitely let me know why in the comments section. But Penn State, the other one inside of the top 10, above Michigan as well for whatever it's worth, and that never feels great, especially off of the past few years where it seems like Penn State is better than the vast majority of the teams in the country. They handle their business about just about everyone outside of Ohio State and Michigan. So that's why Penn State definitely has somewhat of a little brother vibe to it, especially in that Big Ten. Big Ten only getting better, especially with the addition of Oregon. So it is going to be pretty interesting to see whether or not Penn State can sort of overcome the little brother accusations to some degree. And I think that ultimately, 8 is probably a fair landing spot for them. Now, having them right above Michigan is definitely where things get a little bit dicey. But I do think that it is about a fair ranking for them there. That defense is still going to be incredible. Not all that much turnover on the offensive side of the ball, but the key difference, I would argue, this year is being able to go and add a new offensive coordinator in Andy Koltenecki to try and ramp up what we see from Drew Aller, who has a frame that could very much translate to the next level. I think that he could be a good player, but he's just failed to live up to expectations at this point, which has been the case with the James Franklin Nittany Lions these past few years, and they're going to have an excellent opportunity to sort of take a step forward this year. But it is also sort of important to keep in mind as well that what does a step forward look like for Penn State? Because it's not just as simple as making the playoffs, in my opinion, because making the playoffs is so much easier now. They don't have Michigan on their schedule, which almost hurts them a little bit from having the true, benchmarks of where they're able to match up in the overall landscape of the Big Ten. They play Ohio State still, so that obviously going to be one of those benchmark games. I do think Ohio State is, they came in at number 2 for a reason. They have a great case to be the national champions at the end of this year. I think that Ohio State's offense is going to be a weapon. The addition of Will Howard is just such an upgrade over Kyle McCord from last season. They have playmakers. I mentioned Quinshon Judkins leaving Ole Miss last year. He obviously ends up in Ohio State along with Henderson, who's back for another year. Emeka Egbuka, one of the best wide receivers in the country, so that offense is going to be lethal. You always have they have an edge rusher as well. They have playmakers on the defensive side of the ball as well, able to get Caleb Downs from Alabama and the transfer portal themselves as well. So that's obviously going to be one of the games, tying it back to Penn State. But, outside of that, USC is the other one. There is that stretch in the middle of the season with at USC, at Wisconsin, versus Ohio State, and versus Washington. That's probably where we are going to get a better picture of what Penn State can actually be this year. So definitely something I have my eyes on there. Did mention Michigan at number 9. Obviously, a lot of roster turnover. The fact that Jim Harbaugh making the leap to the NFL. Tons of players. I think it was 11, 12 players that ended up getting drafted last year. Sharon Moore now taking over the program with a lot of changes around him, but at the same time, I do think that their identity can be somewhat of the same of what it was these past few years under Jim Harbaugh. Moore was the offensive coordinator and had experience as an O-line coach at one point along the lines as well. The O-line might not be quite as good because, again, a lot of losses there to the NFL draft, but still should be good. They still have Donovan Edwards in the backfield. And Alex Orji, there's definitely a lot of unknown in terms of his throwing ability. When he got his shine at Michigan last year, it was as a runner and during those specific sets for him to use his legs. So, for whatever it's worth, yes, there is still a big-time question mark. I heard the comparison as well to sort of Jalen Milroe and whether that's kind of what we end up viewing him as. Very raw as a passer, but an athlete, big frame, able to use his legs. So I'm definitely very curious to see how that plays out. And, we're running out of time here, so there's so much more. This is our first college football segment of the year here, so trying to cram as much as we can in here. I guess, we'll sort of skip around here, and what I want to finish off here quickly before we run out of time is I do want to look at some teams outside of the top 10 and just look at who could potentially end up making some noise. And when you talk about what this upcoming playoffs is going to look like, and especially the idea of the SEC and the Big Ten dominating, the chance of could they eat up all of the at-large bids, this is a little bit of a make-or-break year almost for the ACC in terms of if they want to retain any amount of power for the upcoming years, that they need to have somebody make a splash for them. Florida State is the highest ranked ACC team at number 10. I think that they have a very good chance to win the ACC outright, but if they're going to be a 2-bid league, I almost think that they're going to need another team to come in and swoop that ACC title. And I think that Miami has a pretty good chance to actually be able to come out and surprise some people this year, because ultimately you look at bringing in Cam Ward, I think that is a big-time addition for them. They have a solid wide receiver core as things already are. The biggest question really with Miami is the coaching staff with Mario Cristobal and, pointing at his mistakes in the past, knee the dang ball. But, outside of that, I do think that this is a very solid roster, and I also just feel like college football is more fun when Miami's good, so that's something that I'm definitely keeping an eye on. I'm not writing out Clemson at this point, but I do feel like with this new NIL and the way that the transfer portal is such a massive part of the sport at this point, seems like Clemson's getting passed by a little bit. They had their lowest ranking coming into the year since 2014. They were number 16 then. They're number 14 this year. So a team to take into consideration, I suppose, as well. But, a team that I don't know exactly how great I feel about it. Some other names as well here. I think that Utah could crash the party a little bit, getting Cam Rising back in his 7th year of college football. And the last time we saw him, we didn't get to see him for all of 2023, but was very talented. Went out with a little bit of a bang and being able to take out USC during Caleb Williams' Heisman year and putting a thrashing on them a little bit. So I think that Utah can make themselves interesting as well. I know number 12 there, a little bit boring. I'm going to go even more boring. But I think that Missouri is just a team. We'll see. I got to do more research on their defense specifically, but I think that their offense is going to be a very fun team going forward in this year. Brady Cook having Luther Burden, that might be the most electric quarterback wide receiver duo in the nation this year. So I think that they could be a little bit of a spoiler to some degree for some of these other SEC teams. And whether or not they could end up sort of being a little bit more of a surprise. They came on late last year, and I think that being able to return the majority of their key players was massive for them. So again, so many different topics to dive into with college football as we're now just over a week away from kickoff. So really exciting there. But that is all the time we have for today. Tried to cram as much as we could for 15 minutes, but we'll definitely be back with more college football as the weeks go on here. But we're now going to be shifting gears over to the NFL for you college football fans as well. J.J. McCarthy, obviously a very polarizing NFL prospect coming into the league, even in college football spheres. People weren't 100% sure whether or not they should get on board with him, but the Vikings took him with the 10th overall pick, and things are not going to plan as early on because it was just announced earlier this morning that he is going to have to undergo knee surgery for a torn meniscus. So we're going to be diving into the latest details surrounding that, what things could look like, the different ways that this could shake out for Minnesota. So we're going to dive into all of that. But first, take a quick break, stick with us, and we will be right back.